Virginia Rappe came into the world on July 7, 1895, in Chicago, Illinois. Her mother was Mabel Rappe, a sometimes coarse girl with no husband or father for her baby daughter. When Virginia was 11, her mother passed away and she went to live with her grandmother. But Virginia had plans. She wanted to be a model and actress in Hollywood. By age 14, she was already posing for local artists and fashion designers. And eventually, she moved to San Francisco, where she made herself known as a model and dress designer. She actually posed for dress designer Robert Moskowitz, and they ended up falling in love and getting engaged. However, he died shortly later in a streetcar accident. After the death of her fiancé, Virginia moved south to Los Angeles to pursue a career on the big screen, and she wasn't unknown during the time. She found work working in silent films with Julian Etling and a very, very young Rudolph Valentino. She actually also received an award during this time for the Best Dressed Girl in Pictures. And it was in 1919 that Virginia actually fell in love again, this time with Hollywood director and producer Henry Learman, which guaranteed work for the young starlet. By 1920, Virginia and Henry were living together and planned to get married. The other major player in this case was Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, who was born March 24, 1887, in Smith Center, Kansas. His parents, Mary and William Arbuckle, were very, very slight in build, which meant that it was a complete shock to them when Roscoe came out weighing over 13 pounds. The size of the child actually made his father believe that he wasn't biologically his at first, and the birth was so traumatic on his mother, Mary, that she ended up dying from complications from it 12 years later. The Arbuckle family moved to Santa Ana when Roscoe was just 8 years old, and his father found work in a hotel. During that time, Roscoe actually first received the nickname of Fatty from some very cruel friends and schoolmates. Frank Bacon's vaudeville company performed over at the Santa Ana Hotel and invited Fatty onto the stage one day. He was actually very happy to oblige because of how the audience responded to him, and he ended up being typecast for the rest of his years as the funny, lovable fat boy. When his mother died, his father cut him off completely, and Fatty went to go work at a hotel, and he ended up getting a singing gig at the hotel bar, and he had a really, really, really great response from it from all the patrons who came there. And it was at this time that Sid Grauman invited him to perform in the Unique Theater in San Francisco. From there, he traveled to the Pantages Theater Group, where he met his soon-to-be wife, Minta Durfee. His career took off really fast then, and he ended up going on a tour of China and Japan in 1909, and he was doing bit parts for just $3 a day. Paramount Pictures saw his potential, and they gave him a contract for $1,000 each day, plus royalties of 25% on his work. By 1918, Paramount offered him an unheard of contract. It was $3 million to appear in 18 movies over 3 years. This contract actually made Fatty the highest paid actor in Hollywood, second only to Charlie Chaplin. It was on Labor Day weekend in 1921 that Fatty and his pals Lowell Sherman and Fred Fishback planned a party to pass the time. Despite prohibition, Fred promised a weekend with lots of alcohol, women, and general debauchery. Fred procured a bootleg case of gin and reserved rooms 1219, 1220, and 1221 at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco. Virginia and her friend Bambina Maud Delmont were invited to the party and arrived at about 10:30 a.m. that day. Virginia's manager and Fatty's friend, Al Semnacher, accompanied the women. 10 minutes later, more people came to the party, including showgirls Zay Pyron and Alice Blake. Virginia this was not the first time that she met Fatty. Her fiancé was actually a longtime acquaintance of the actor, and he would later claim that Virginia was completely revolted by Fatty due to his crude and classless behavior. He said that she was completely unaware that Fatty would have been there that day, and Virginia basically ignored him at the party, but did have quite a bit to drink that day. She was actually very unwell by the afternoon and excused herself to go into room 1219, which was Fatty's private suite. Fatty followed her in there shortly after and locked the door. What happened behind the doors that day, no one's ever going to know, but there are some assumptions that have been gathered based on what Virginia said to her friend when they found her screaming in agony in the room later that afternoon. And it was her friend who accompanied her to the party, Bambina Maud Delmont, who she was the first one to realize that something was wrong because she heard this tortured screaming from Fatty's room. She went to the room concerned about, she didn't see her friend anywhere, and Fatty answered the door, and he was only wearing pajamas and a robe at that time. Behind him in the room, on the smaller of the two beds that were in there, Virginia was laying there screaming in pain and tearing at her clothing. This is a very important point. Virginia screamed, "He did this. He hurt me. I'm dying." Maud accused Fatty of raping and trying to murder her friend. And at some point during this whole story, Al Semnacher arrived at the scene and for some reason suggested that they put her in an ice bath to help sober her up, because at this point they didn't know what was wrong. They just knew she was in pain and she was screaming horribly, but there were no real visible signs of injury on her. Once they put her in the ice bath, she actually started screaming more and the pain became worse. They started rubbing ice on her belly and nothing was working. During that time, Fatty actually threatened to throw Virginia out a window, but he just left the room instead. Al and Maud brought in the hotel doctor, whose name was Dr. Carho, to examine Virginia. By now it was 4 p.m. He couldn't find anything wrong with her, though. Again, there were no visible signs of injury, but Virginia was complaining of unbearable agony. And it was at 7 p.m. that they called for the doctor to return, and this time it was a Dr. Birdsley, and he decided to give Virginia a shot of morphine to help her sleep off whatever was going on. Birdsley returned again at 4 a.m. and then again at 5 a.m. on September 6th, and he admitted that he thought Virginia might actually be suffering from internal injuries and probably needed surgery. When he inserted a metal catheter into her urethra, he said he knew instantly that her bladder had been injured, but he didn't know the severity or reason for the injury. He speculated external force causes most bladder ruptures, a slight fall, or severe vomiting could be a cause as well, but he doubted any of those as the reasons. Maud spent the day in the hotel with Virginia, watching her drift in and out of consciousness, and Fatty and his pals took off to go to Los Angeles. In her lucid moments, Virginia continued to scream in agony, and Maud asked the doctor to return because it seemed like her friend Virginia was getting much worse. The doctor agreed that this was beyond his scope and she actually probably should go to a hospital, but the group was worried because at that time the rooms were still covered with a lot of evidence about their illegal drinking the day before, and they didn't want police to come to the scene. At this point it gets a little bit strange because they decided to take her to a place called the Wakefield Sanitarium, and it was mainly a maternity hospital, but they also performed abortions as well. The initial diagnosis when they got there was alcohol poisoning. Virginia spent a few days there and her condition continued to decline. During her wakeful moments, Virginia continued to insist that Fatty did it to her, and she slipped into a coma and died on September 9th, 1921. Immediately, Dr. Rumwell and Dr. Orphis performed an autopsy at the request of her friends, and they confirmed that Virginia's bladder had been ruptured. In their expert opinions, the injury to the bladder was between 1 and 12 days old. It appeared distended but also exposed to force. The doctors removed her stomach and sent it to the city chemist for testing. They also removed Virginia's female parts and instructed an orderly to incinerate them. The orderly was stopped just in time. The state of California requires a coroner to perform all autopsies when the manner of death is unclear. Rumwell and Orphis' autopsy was completely unauthorized. The organs were recovered and given to Dr. Strange, who would perform an official autopsy. Dr. Strange determined that the cause of death was peritonitis, an infection of the membrane lining the abdominal wall. In their expert opinion, Virginia's ruptured, it resulted from the ruptured bladder. The bladder was ruptured by an external force. The theory is that Roscoe Arbuckle applied external force during the commission of sexual assault. That very day, Fatty Arbuckle was arrested and charged with the murder of Virginia Rappe. The investigation was a circus, at best. Fatty was arrested and charged with first-degree murder on September 10th. The state of California at the time disallowed bail on any murder case. Still, Fatty was released the same day on his own recognizance. Before he left jail in San Francisco, the headlines had appeared. Reporters everywhere painted Fatty as a hedonist and a brute. His Labor Day party was written up as an orgy. Rumors of rape by glass bottles sent journalists into a tailspin. The same newspapers printed disparaging statements about Virginia's character. They didn't write her up as a rising starlet who met a sad and untimely end. Instead, they chose to depict Virginia as a woman of loose character who was just throwing her clothes off at any party she attended. It was reported incorrectly that Virginia had venereal disease. Max Sennett even accused poor Virginia of causing such a crab outbreak that he had to fumigate the entire studio. Neither Fatty or Virginia got a fair shake from the press during this time. William Randolph Hearst himself said that Arbuckle's debacle sold more papers than the sinking of the Lusitania. If the investigation was a circus, the trial was a dumpster fire. The malicious gossip didn't stop at the courtroom doors. The first order of business from the defense was to discredit any possible witnesses. They were all drunk, according to his lawyers. Maud Delmont was a liar and a madwoman. Those who couldn't be discredited mysteriously forgot what happened by the time they reached the witness stand. Al Sumnacher had one important recollection. He recalled Fatty told him to place a piece of ice inside Virginia. He was asked to repeat the statement in Fatty's exact words, and Al couldn't bring himself to say it. Instead, he wrote them down. The DA read it aloud, and it said, "He said, put a piece of ice in Virginia Rappe's snatch." The prosecution took the same ugly course of action by attempting to defame Fatty. Roscoe was a sex fiend who came from a broken home. He was nothing more than a drunken drug addict misogynist like his father before him. Fatty endured 3 trials in this case. Virginia's grieving fiancé said under oath that he would kill Fatty on sight if he wasn't convicted. However, they couldn't convict him on a murder charge, so they downgraded it to manslaughter. During the 3rd trial, Fatty's attorney encouraged him to keep his mouth shut. He gave an attorney-approved account of the night's events that directly opposed Maud's ever-changing story. Fatty claimed that Virginia was hysterical. He only washed Virginia's face and laid her on the bed. She fell on the floor, and he picked her up. It wasn't his fault that she tore her clothing to shreds. All he did was help her. A jury acquitted Roscoe on April 13, 1922. However, the damage to Fatty's reputation was irreparable. Theater owners and moviegoers alike boycotted Fatty's movies. He was a social pariah, unable to work under his own name, and eventually died of a heart attack at age 46. 100 years later, there is a new theory out there that Virginia sustained a bladder injury during a botched abortion, unrelated to the events of Fatty's party. There's something to substantiate that claim. It's just one of the possibilities of what happened. Again, there were a lot of different accounts of that day, and there was a lot said during the trials, but in the end, they didn't convict him, and they never really had a good resolution to this particular case, which is really sad because it's, and it's probably never going to be solved. No one's ever going to really know what happened in the room, but there is probably a lot to be said about the fact that Virginia's dying words, the only thing that she talked about was the fact that Fatty had done something to her, but we'll never really know what. I hope you enjoyed this case. I have a fascination with Hollywood's glory days and the things that happened then, so you're probably going to see more cases related to that. Let me know what you think about the audio on this case. I get a lot of feedback, varying feedback, that sometimes whisper is preferred and sometimes soft-spoken. So let me know what you think and what you want to hear, because I make these videos for you, and I would love to know your feedback on them. Please be on the lookout for another video coming soon about 10 unknown facts about the movie The Wizard of Oz. As always, if you have any suggestions of cases, I would love to hear them. Please drop them in the comments below. Other than that, I hope you all have a great weekend, and I look forward to seeing you guys soon.